So now it is my pleasure to invite two of the country's leading experts on racial inequality to join me for a discussion. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rashawn Ray, who I've known for many years, and I'm proud that he serves on the board of the Greater Washington Community Foundation. Dr. Ray is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland. He's also, yay, I hear the Maryland cheers over there. And he's also an accomplished author and researcher, organizer, and TV news pundit. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rashawn Ray. Dr. Ray. So next, I'm pleased to welcome Professor Thomas Shapiro, who is a professor of law and social policy at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. Dr. Shapiro is the award-winning co-author of Black Wealth, White Wealth, and is a leader in the asset development field, with a particular focus on closing the racial wealth gap. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Shapiro.
Thank you.
It's very nice to be in the company of both of these scholars. In 2019, I had the pleasure, before I had this role at the foundation, of being on a panel with you too, Dr. Ray, and I think I was moderated by Dr. Camille Bousset. And it's amazing that we're here now having this conversation 3 years later. I'm excited by it. So you all just heard me outline the foundation's new 10-year strategy, just some of the high-level points around our strategy to close the racial wealth gap in this country. I'd love for you to talk about, based in your experience and your research, what is it going, just talk about the causes and the consequences of the racial wealth gap. Let's start with the sort of fundamental basics about the causes and the consequences of the racial wealth gap.
Sure, thank you, and welcome everybody. It is a pleasure to be here, especially out in public, and to begin to be part of a great conversation for this area. I am personally and politically utterly thrilled that the Community Foundation has set a North Star of closing racial wealth inequality in this region. I think it's a journey that will begin a deep-seated and much-needed conversation. And hopefully along the way, we're actually going to make some progress. So some of the causes, and I really want to start with, I want to link back to the part about policy and structure. And I want to give a specific example that I think it hits home for me, and I hope it hits home for a lot of us that are here this evening. A family, typically a woman, a poor woman, that is receiving some kind of social assistance, has that social assistance asset tested. That is, she, in that instance, cannot have over a certain amount of assets in a bank account. In most states, it's about $2,500. And if she has more than $2,500 in that account, she is no longer eligible for food, for fuel, for clothes in winter, for public housing subsidy, whatever the social assistance might be. So there's a structured way that policy is determined that poor people cannot be allowed to save. They cannot be allowed to get ahead. They need to stay on the cliff. All right. Now, I worked at a university for 45 years. I'm not that old, of course. And as part of my benefit at that university, I have a 403B pension plan. That is, the federal government figuratively subsidizes that plan for me because I don't pay taxes on that income. 5% of my income goes into that plan. The university throws another 10%. So for people like me, there's a great encouragement to save. In fact, there's a subsidy to it compared to what the structure and the policy says for a lower socioeconomic situation where savings is in fact penalized. And that's a way in which my wealth increases because of that federal structured policy intervention, and the wealth of a lot of other people is stymied in that particular instance. And that's just one example. And maybe as this journey goes on, we can start to see many examples like that that begin to look like a larger, looping back on itself system.
I appreciate the very specific example, because sometimes when we talk about policies and systems, it's not always crystal clear what it is that what we mean. That was an amazing example. Dr. Ray?
Yeah, I mean, as usual, Dr. Shapiro is always on point and has us thinking about what happens specifically in our lives. First, I just have to give kudos to you, Tonia, to President Wellons, and to the Greater Washington Community Foundation. This is amazing. This is amazing. It is great to be in person, and as a trustee, kind of thinking about this vision moving forward. It is exactly where the foundation should be. And when we talk about the causes of the racial wealth gap, I think there are two big historical periods to highlight. Of course, enslavement is one, but it's important to think about the monetary value attached to that. In 1860, black people's physical bodies were worth $3 billion with a B. Just our physical bodies. We're not talking about what we produce. We're not talking about crops. And it's important to note that at that time, that was in $1860. I want you all to think about that. Today, $3 billion is a whole bunch of money.
Yeah.
In 1860, it is almost immeasurable. It was worth more than railroads and factories put together. That is the first point. And that 1860 point is important because we know 5 years later, the Civil War ended. And of course, we know that supposedly what was supposed to happen is black people were supposed to get some form of reparations that they didn't get, which we'll be talking about. The second main period, though, because there are people who say, well, my family wasn't around during enslavement. So how do we think about since that time period? Well, there's a classic book called When Affirmative Action Was White, by Ira Katz Nelson. There's also another classic book called Black Wealth, White Wealth by Melvin Oliver and Thomas Shapiro, which helped to establish the foundation for how I think about the racial wealth gap. And part of what these works highlight is if we go back to the New Deal policy following the Great Depression, that helped to establish the middle class that we know to exist today, but not necessarily just the middle class, but specifically the white middle class, because it allowed for four things to happen. First, it allowed for people to send their children to college. It allowed for them to go to college themselves. It allowed for people to start up small businesses with grants. And fourth, it allowed for them to get grants for home ownership. When we start talking about education, home ownership, and small businesses, that establishes the bedrock of how we think about the middle class and really the upper middle class today. Why is it racialized? Because black people were not given those same opportunities. Whites and blacks went to World War II to fight in the same way. 8 out of 10 men born during the 1920s were drafted to go to war. If we fast forward to the 1950s and 1960s, these men were 30 and 40-year-olds with families. Black veterans were not given that same money. That money was mandated federally and allocated locally via states. This is the reason why we have so many historically black colleges and universities to this day. And it's important to note that with less resources, these HBCUs continue to thrive and actually graduate the most black students and send the most black people on to get graduate degrees. So I think when we talk about the causes, these are two fundamental causes that we should highlight.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. It's interesting because when in just my remarks, I'm saying, hey, let's think about education and small businesses and home ownership, because those are things that we know that have traditionally been able to help accumulate wealth. In your book, Dr. Shapiro, you talk about the hidden cost of being African American. I'd love it if you'd help us to just understand, again, what some of those hidden costs are and what the implications are for widening inequality in our country.
Sure, thank you. Let me build a little bit on Dr. Ray's very astute observations. What I mean and what I think others mean by hidden cost is that sometimes we can look at a dollar figure and that gives us a gross description of what's going on. But it doesn't really tell us what's going on with the people who live that. Mm-hmm. And so maybe let me try and back into that just a little bit. And the example I want to use is student debt, a hot button issue certainly in this town and across the nation. Virtually every survey that we're able to look at tells us it's a very popular issue to cancel some amount of student debt. The fact of the matter is that African Americans who've gone to college, who've gone to higher education, a higher percentage of those folks have student debt. And the median amount of the student debt that African Americans who've gone to higher education have is actually higher than it is for whites who've matriculated to similar kinds of institutions. A higher percentage, and the debt load is higher. Now, why might that be the case? Let's not go to silly explanations about, well, maybe people don't want to pay off loans. Let's think about the degree to which certification and degrees have become so important in American society that it's almost mandatory for people to go to higher education today to even think about some kind of middle-class status or some kind of economic security. And we've gotten to that point as a nation. And we've gotten to that point where college tuitions have risen dramatically so that folks can't afford it in nearly the same way. The states have been particularly bad about cutting back their public investment to higher education. We know the story with Pell Grant's student-subsidized loans for students. Those have not been able to keep up with inflation. And that's how we get to that complex of more students going to higher education and having to take on tremendous debt loads because of that. Now, the other point I would simply, maybe not so simply, but try and connect to that is, why don't we ask ourselves in a public, very deep discourse, why is it that more African American and Latinx students need student loans than whites? Now, whites need student loans to a high degree as well, but not nearly in the same proportion. And part of the answer to that, obviously, is they come from families who are much better positioned to help them with tuition. The other part of the answer that's not nearly as obvious is the answer of inheritance. Almost 40%, is about 38, 39% of whites have either inherited money or expect to inherit money. Now, a little grain of salt about expectation when people are asked that. Sometimes it doesn't pan out. But about 38, 39%. And the median amount of that inheritance for whites is close to $200,000. Among African Americans, it's about 16%. And the median amount of that inheritance is about $100,000. So you have that disparity in who is going to inherit right away, and then the amount that actually is inherit. And if we bake that back into the equation of why student loans exist the way they do, I think we get to the answers very quickly.
Perfect, thank you. You know, part of this conversation is really to help to instigate the unique examples, but also, as I said in my remarks, to help us to broaden our imagination about what's possible for us in philanthropy and in the private sector to help to close the gap. Dr. Ray, you know, I'd love if you talk about some of the ways that there remains the additional harm that is being experienced on Black and brown communities when it comes to you know, the wealth gap. If you could just talk about some of the additional harm.
Yeah, I mean, to build on what Dr. Shapiro stated about these hidden costs, a lot of these costs are rooted in how we think about racial segregation. Let's take Washington, D.C. We're in 2022. We could go back to 1922, and Southeast D.C. compared to Northwest D.C., which is one of the places where I work at the Brookings Institution, basically look the same in terms of racial composition and class composition. That's highly problematic because we know, based on redlining, the Southeast and really the eastern part of Washington, D.C., where these amazing kids, by the way, were up here playing drums and playing things that I couldn't even imagine doing, are cut off from access to resources. That access to resources are rooted in these hidden costs. One of the big ways it pops up is in property values. Accordingly, in addition to property values, it pops up in interest rates. Let me quickly talk about both of those, and then I'll quickly talk about policing, of course, which leads to what happens when people are highly segregated. It leads to the ability for people to be segregated and be over-policed or under-policed. Because not only do we have to talk about the over-policing of black communities, we also oftentimes have to talk about the under-policing of other communities. But when we talk about redlining, my colleague at Brookings, Andre Perry, has done a lot of work, and I've done some work with him, looking at home values. And when you compare black neighborhoods to white neighborhoods, controlling for everything under the sun, those black neighborhoods, homes in black neighborhoods, are worth $48,000 less per home. That's roughly $50,000 per home. A student could go to University of Maryland, where I work at, basically their entire time, their tuition is paid. And this is part of what Dr. Shapiro is getting at, part of these hidden costs, what is wrapped up in equity in terms of people's values. And then we have to get at the interest rates. Not only in terms of people living in black neighborhoods getting higher interest rates. This is one of the reasons why, from Wells Fargo to Bank of America and other major banking institutions, they have been hit with major lawsuits having to pay back money because they have given black people subprime loans. But also, even if you attend a HBCU, research documents that people who attend HBCUs are more likely to receive unsubsidized loans. Part of what that means in the education space is if you have a subsidized loan, then your loan will not start accumulating interest until you graduate, okay? If you have an unsubsidized loan, your loan starts accumulating interest immediately. We can think about the differences between those two and how that dovetails into what Dr. Shapiro said. Now, accordingly, segregation also plays a role in policing. And part of what it does is it's not only about the fact that hate actually costs money, or it pays. See, we got to be very clear about that when it comes to civilian payouts for police misconduct. But it is also the fact that it impacts our health profiles, and it also impacts our ability to access resources like banking institutions to try to get access to resources that will lower interest rates and give us more access to capital for education, for small businesses, and homes. So, I mean, you put all this together, and racial segregation plays a big role, and we really simply have to look at our own city here in D.C. to see how it manifests and actually is replicated across the country.
Thank you. Dr. Shapiro, do you want to add something here? Thank you, Dr. Ray.
No, that's pretty thorough.
Yeah, it is. It absolutely is. Thank you. You want to give a hand really quickly for our colleagues? So, you know, we have an audience of people who like to solve problems. And I'm just appreciating that when we first started talking about our North Star being the racial wealth gap, there was a lot of negotiation. You were in those rooms about whether this was something that we could do something about and should do something about. I'd love it if you all would just talk about, you know, what are some of the solutions? What are some of the paths that we ought to pursue as we think about pursuing this North Star?
It's a long list. But I think the point, especially for a community foundation, is to be as strategic as possible and to figure out what, in fact, might the local levers be that would have some traction in making the lives of people better in a way that closes racial wealth inequality. And so I heard your presentation, and I would just like to underline a couple of policy interventions which I think are very important.
Okay.
I think children's savings accounts, baby bonds. Baby bonds are essentially children's savings accounts on steroids. And we have a good field of evidence and demonstration on children's savings accounts. There are now 1.2 million children who have children's savings accounts in hundreds of communities across the country. 2 or 3 states, that's now their state policy: Nevada, California, and Maine. The city of San Francisco has had a robust program for many, many years. So it's not as if something has to be created anew on children's savings accounts, and I would argue baby bonds, because we can look at best practices. We can see the experience of others, implement those best practices, and innovate from there. You also mentioned earlier, my ears really perked up because I think it's a challenge to the community as well. issues around procurement, everything that comes into your building, everything that comes into your office, everything that comes into your corporation, everything that comes into your organization. Take an inventory of that and see if it can be more locally sourced, see if those sourcing can be more diverse, see if programs can be set up that might actually help to train people and provide the financial assets so they can start that business internally themselves and take it outside. I think in an area like Washington, D.C., that's a prime suspect for moving forward to closing the racial wealth gap. And just finally, for the moment, just because the bucket is really deep here, I want to mention the mortgage interest deduction. Mortgage interest deduction is still, even with the reforms, is several $billions. When the institute that I used to direct did some modeling and asked the question, who is benefiting from the mortgage interest tax deduction? It is largely middle class and upper middle class whites who tend to live in suburban America. And we simply ask the question, what if home ownership rates were roughly equal white, black, and brown? What would the distribution of the mortgage interest tax deduction look like? And I don't remember the exact number, so don't quote me, but I think it was like $2 to $3 billion each year is left on the table because of the hidden cost of mortgage discrimination and residential segregation. Now, personally, I would like to take the federal subsidy that is the mortgage interest tax deduction and convert it and not make it just for home ownership, but for affordable apartments, for safe communities, so that renters could take part of it, and then it becomes much more of a housing security policy rather than helping folks who arguably could buy homes anyways, buy one that's a little larger.
Thank you. Dr. Ray?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just build on this. I mean, essentially what we just heard Tom say is going from the individual level to the community level. How do we think about this? That's important because of the way that we know that racial segregation operates. And I'll kind of mention a couple of things. I think the first big thing, if you are in the banking industry, you really need to think about home appraisals. See, home appraisals helps to drive the value that comes to people's home. And the devaluing of black property is part of the reason why people don't have equity in their home to send their children to college without taking out loans, to start up a small businesses, to invest in their local communities. That's one big one that I think is important. We need to diversify the banking industry and also the appraisal industry. But I'll just mention the big one, the big elephant in the room. I mentioned earlier about how in 1860, the amount of money that black physical bodies represented. And we know that right down the street that President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, pretty much that then took away the quote-unquote 40 acres and a mule that General Sherman aimed to implement to ensure that black people were able to get some sort of restitution for that. And then we know right down the road on Capitol Hill that part of what happened at the Lincoln Memorial was Dr. King talked about, I have a dream, and everybody always talks about that. Well, what people miss is that he also talked about how we have come to cash a check that has been marked with insufficient funds. And what he was talking about was reparations. And so when we start talking about addressing the racial wealth gap, which, mind you, in most years is 10 to 1 on average, meaning the average white family has 10 times the amount of wealth that the average black family does. Education does little to close that gap. It shrinks to about 7 to 1, meaning you have a black person and a white person graduate from college and their wealth is disparate by 7 times. That is astronomical. It should not be that way if education is supposed to be the great equalizer that we know, unfortunately, it is not. So when it comes to reparations, it's not only thinking about individualized reparations, but from a community perspective, thinking about investment in education, thinking about investment in housing, thinking about investment in small businesses. And then also when it comes to low-income families, and this is being done across the country, even here in D.C., is thinking about a guaranteed income, which is to make up that inflation gap. If you're like me, The last time you tried to fill up your tank or get bread or milk, you were like, what the heck is going on right now? Now, imagine being a low-income, single parent trying to raise children in America and in a place like Washington, D.C. It is almost unimaginable that they actually come through that way. So specifically, we have to think about reparation strategies. And I'll say that in the state of Maryland, and this is why it's relevant, in the state of Maryland, Delegate Juanica Fisher has been presenting the Harriet Tubman Community Investment Act that thinks about these things from a community perspective. And then it's also thinking about making up that gap with inflation, because we know over the past 40 years, wages have not kept track with inflation. And yes, some of us in here are high wage earners. That is amazing. But many of the people in our communities are being left behind, even though they are the ones serving our food, bringing our smoothies in the middle of the day, dropping off our Amazon packages, and yet still they're struggling to put food on the table. That is wrong, and we need to do something about it. And I think some of these strategies can help.
I appreciate it. You know, there is never enough time to have a full-on conversation in the middle of a gala about race and about wealth. But I can't imagine two people who I'd prefer to have the conversation with than you. I want to thank you all for opening the door to this conversation. We're talking about, at the Community Foundation, we're talking about race and about wealth, two of the stickiest conversations you could possibly have. And part of the reason that we spend so much time talking about the learning journey, or how we want to understand what got us here so that we can figure out how we get out of this place, is because if we don't spend the time together, we will continue to diverge. We'll continue to fund things that are not going to really make things better for anybody. These are stopgap solutions, and we're saying, we think as the nation's capital region, we can do better than that. There are way too many smart people, there's way too many resources for us to not be thoughtful and progressive in our investment strategies about how we close this gap. It's better for all of us that we do. And so just join me in giving, I want to check the time. Cut, okay. Please join me in giving an amazing round of applause to Dr. Shapiro and Dr. Rashawn Ray. Great. Awesome.